I call Grant Robertson.
Mr Speaker, it's absolutely remarkable to be here in this House tonight and see the appalling contributions from the National Party members on this bill. You know, I stood up in this House in my very first speech and I looked across at the National Party and I said, despite our political differences, I know that the members over there are here to do the best they can. They're here because they've got things they believe in and they've come to Parliament to put them in place. Well, tonight we have a member who entered Parliament at the same time as me, Mr Speaker, putting forward as his political epitaph, because he's not going to be here after the next election, putting forward a bill that is a disgraceful attack on democracy. It's petty, it's meaningless, and it's unbelievable tonight, Mr Speaker, to feel that the National Party will not get up and even give proper speeches as to why they are supporting this bill. This bill went to a select committee and was made worse, Mr Speaker. This was an appalling bill made worse at the select committee because they've actually managed not only to attempt to take away the vote from people sentenced to crimes for less than 3 years, they've actually succeeded in the committee on opening it up. So that now the William Bells of this world, who we hear so often from the other side of the House about how this side of the House seems to be sympathetic to those sorts of criminals, that side of the House has now produced a bill that's actually going to open it up for those people to have a vote. It might be a mistake. They might blame the officials. Well, they can't blame the officials when they didn't even bring the Ministry of Justice officials, the actual people who are the experts on this, in to advise them, Mr Speaker. But that simply typifies the approach of the National Government on these issues. This kind of legislation is the simple stuff, the meaningless stuff, the hard work of the criminal justice area, of actually trying to make sure that we rehabilitate people and we reintegrate people into society. That's not what we hear from the National Party. We have Judith Collins celebrating the fact we're building another prison. It's great for the economy. This is a short-sighted government on law and order, and this is a short-sighted bill. Mr Speaker, if people on the other side of the House who often lecture the Labour Party about democracy are truly committed to democracy, then upholding democracy for people in society who we might not always think of in a positive light is actually the true test of whether you're committed to democracy. The true test of being committed to democracy is saying that even if people have committed some of these crimes, we still fundamentally believe that they have a human right to vote. And if we actually want people to rehabilitate and reintegrate into society, Mr Speaker, we need to give people a chance to be involved in society. Virtually every person who's covered by the extension of this law, the 2,000 or 3,000 people who are sentenced each year to less than 3 years, every single one of those people will end up back in society. We're not talking here, even though with the mistake the National Party's made they almost are, we're not talking here about the long-term people sentenced to life imprisonment. That's already in the law. Every single one of the people that this extension applies to will be back in society. What we should be doing is working out how we reintegrate those people into society, how we contribute to rehabilitation. Instead, we have a petty, spiteful piece of legislation that does nothing to make our communities safer. There is nothing in this bill to make our communities safer, and shouldn't that, Mr Speaker, be the aim of criminal justice policy in this country? Shouldn't the aim of any law brought forward in this sector to this Parliament be about making this community safer? Instead, we have a petty bill that will do nothing in that way. It doesn't address serious criminals, Mr Speaker. That's already dealt with in the law. This is a petty, spiteful attempt to try and curry favour with a populist issue. It will do nothing for our communities, Mr Speaker. It is wrong in principle. It is wrong in terms of all of the human rights law globally and in New Zealand, the Bill of Rights Act. And we saw in the Attorney-General's opinion why this bill is unacceptable in New Zealand. We can look internationally and see in virtually every jurisdiction where this has come up, decisions have been made to go in the opposite direction from what New Zealand is doing. There's even a statement, Mr Speaker, from the Department of Corrections in their report that this will look bad for New Zealand internationally. This will damage New Zealand's international reputation. And that's Paul Quinn doesn't mind about that. He doesn't care about trampling on New Zealand's international relationship. He is damaged, Mr. Cosgrove, but he doesn't care about New Zealand's reputation. He doesn't care that an international law, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, what's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights beside Paul Quinn? Paul Quinn or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Which are we going to choose, Mr. Speaker? Because tonight the National Party is choosing to ignore international human rights law, New Zealand human rights law, practical difference, actually making communities safer. That's all been ignored tonight to allow Paul Quinn to put up a petty, spiteful, meaningless piece of legislation in this House. Mr. Speaker, not only is this bill wrong in principle, it is wrong in practice, and my colleagues have already talked about the fact that it creates massive inconsistencies among people who, for instance, are put in home detention, people who are in prison on a particular day that an election is held, versus those who aren't, people who are put in prison on remand. All of these inconsistencies are created by this law, yet Mr. Quinn seems to think it can just sail through the House. It's actually there is no evidence being provided whatsoever, Mr. Speaker, to the committee or to this House that this will have any kind of positive impact around the idea of recidivism. That's one of the arguments that gets put up. No evidence whatsoever supplied to the committee. Internationally, the evidence is in the other direction, that if you actually want to address recidivism, if you actually want to stop people committing crimes, you need to work with those people to rehabilitate them, actually include them in society, Mr. Speaker. But this bill doesn't just take away people's right to vote, it takes people off the electoral roll. How farcical is it, Mr. Speaker, when it is so difficult in this country to actually get people enrolled, that we would put through a bill in this House that takes people off the electoral roll? This bill is a practical mess, Mr. Speaker. It's going to have to, if it goes through its second reading tonight, at the committee stages, it will need massive change, because Mr. Quinn himself needs to respond, or National Party members need to respond to those who've actually highlighted that this bill will in fact make it for those who are currently in prison serving terms more than 3 years, that they actually now will be allowed to vote. So that shambles has to be sorted out. We've got all of the inconsistencies, but overall, Mr. Speaker, what we've got is an in-principle problem with this bill. Because if people in this House are committed to democracy, standing up for democracy means standing up when democracy challenges you. It doesn't mean taking simplistic, petty approaches and saying, we'll just cut off the vote for these people now. We'll just take away their democratic rights. If people are truly committed to democracy, Mr. Speaker, then this is the moment to stand up and say, this bill will not support democracy. It has nothing going for it, Mr. Speaker. It doesn't make our communities safer. It's going to make New Zealand an international laughingstock. It goes against our own domestic Bill of Rights law. It's impractical. There is nothing going for this bill whatsoever, Mr. Speaker, but much, much more than that, Mr. Speaker. This is actually an attack on our democracy and an attack on our community. We should be in this House debating criminal justice law that is about reducing crime, that is about attacking the causes of crime. We should be debating in this House, how do we rehabilitate people? How do we reintegrate people into society? How do we stop recidivism? They're hard conversations, Mr. Speaker. It's difficult law to make. But what we have seen consistently from the National Party is simplistic approaches, supporting the three strikes law and now supporting this law, building more prisons rather than stopping people getting into prison in the first place. We need proper criminal justice law in this country, Mr. Speaker. It's not coming from that side of the House. This law is one of the worst examples of it. Members over there know that. They should not be voting for this law tonight. We need a proper conversation in this country about criminal justice. This bill has absolutely no part in that whatsoever, and it should be voted down tonight.
I call Cam